For the week of January 4th, 2026, this is what's coming up on CT Examiner Weekly.
I'm Editor-in-Chief Greg Stroud. January 12th marks the third anniversary for legal sales of recreational marijuana in the state of Connecticut. But what is the state of the industry? Its promises of safety, equity, and tax dollars 3 years on. We'll find out in this special edition of CT Examiner.
All that and more marijuana-related topics. And joining me, I'm the host, Brian Scott Smith, along with Greg Stroud. I'm also joined by three panelists, Erin Gorman Kirk, Lou Rinaldi, and Tess Eidem. Welcome to you all. Now, marijuana, cannabis, weed, it goes by a variety of names, and this month Connecticut celebrates 3 years of adult recreational use cannabis sales in the state. But the industry has been plagued over the past 3 years with concerns about the levels of mold and yeast in cannabis products being sold, medical marijuana users unhappy with the quality and availability of product they use for medicinal purposes, and two public agencies, the Department of Consumer Protection and the Social Equity Council, both drawing criticism from cannabis users and growers over their roles and actions they have taken over the past 3 years that have left the market and the industry in Connecticut in a state of disarray. Today, Greg Stroud and I are joined by three experts in the cannabis industry to talk about the state of play here in Connecticut. We're joined by Erin Gorman Kirk, Connecticut's Cannabis Ombudsman, appointed and paid for through an insurance fund through the Office of Healthcare Advocacy. Lou Rinaldi, a medical cannabis patient advocate, and Tess Eidem, a microbiologist and senior research associate who specializes in cannabis quality and safety, among other things, from the University of Colorado. Now, before we start our conversation with everyone, we should point out that CT Examiner Weekly extended an invite to the Department of Consumer Protection and the Social Equity Council to take part in this discussion, but both agencies declined our invitation. So let's start the discussion. Lou Rinaldi, you've been a very outspoken critic of the state and its handling of recreational use as well as medical and the impacts it's had on the industry. It's a tall order, but can you maybe encapsulate some of the main issues for us?
Absolutely, Brian, and thanks again for having us. So the main issues, we have an industry right now that, as you said, we're 3 years into adult use. And almost immediately after that milestone was reached, there were reports in local news of patients, medical patients who had been part of a program that went back many years prior. Suddenly, once adult use began, they were unable to find a lot of the products that they were accustomed to. They were unable to obtain the medicine that they needed. And generally, we think of the patient triangle is a term that I like to use, which has three pillars. There's access, affordability, and quality. And we've focused primarily on access in Connecticut. And a lot of the time we're told to just be happy that it's legal. And I think that's plays into the whole access side of it. But the issues, in addition to not taking care of patients, we haven't taken care of our social equity applicants either. We've got a social equity council that outnumbers the staff of the council outnumbers the operational social equity businesses in the state, which is kind of shocking. You would think it might be the other way around. We're now the only state in the country, I believe, the only legal market in the country that taxes cannabis based on potency. It's depending on the type of product. There's different taxes based on the amount of THC, the milligrams of THC within that product. Other states surrounding us, for example, Massachusetts and Rhode Island, both tax roughly 10% of the retail price. New York recently switched from a potency tax to a wholesale tax. So we are sort of this island of tax inefficiency from a revenue generation standpoint. So we've got barriers to entry to the market. We have very limited licensing. We've got the 4 incumbent licensees from the medical program who dominate the supply chain to this day and have essentially co-opted social equity to be able to expand their already outsized footprint at a reduced cost and with favorable optics.
I just want to jump in, and Greg's got a comment.
So Lou, did Connecticut just sort of reinvent the wheel? Is there a model out there? Is there a reason why Connecticut reinvented the wheel? Or is it over-regulated, under-regulated, badly regulated? What's when you look out there in the landscape, where is recreational, where is legal sales of cannabis working in the United States? So
when you talk about a market that's working well, from a legislator standpoint, they want to hear about tax efficiency, because a lot of um, the reason that it passed in Connecticut, quite frankly, was for the revenue potential. And a lot of our legislators won't admit that, but that is in fact the case. So if you want to look at high performing markets in that context, you're generally looking, until very recently, you were looking at Michigan. There's one township in Michigan known as New Buffalo that on a monthly basis outsells the entire state of Connecticut, because they have a certain regulatory philosophy. They treat cannabis as a commercial commodity. Another counterpoint to that is Washington State generally treats it as a sin tax. They treat it as a vice, where they have a large user base and they extract the maximum amount of revenue and leave the businesses with very thin margins. So that's another approach that some states have taken. Connecticut's approach is born out of sort of this puritanical mindset, this paternalism and this control. It's almost like a social engineering experiment where it's legal, but we've tried to regulate how much potency is available for any given product, and to control what people are, consuming through, as a function of the regulation. So it's very much a nanny state type of approach. And we've also, there's the lobbyists who were pushing to legalize in the first place raised a lot of noise about price compression in more mature markets. And to try to avoid that happening here, we basically locked up the market for only the very wealthy and well-connected to be able to enter the market at all. And all of those decisions have come back to bite us in one way or another. I hope that's a helpful answer there, Greg.
It is, Lou. I want to bring in Erin, because Erin, of course, was appointed as the nation's, and I believe you possibly are still the nation's first cannabis ombudsman. Your role was to look at the medical marijuana sector, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong there. In the time that you've been in place, which I believe is a couple of years now, what do you feel that you've achieved and what is still missing?
Thank you so much. First of all, I've been in about 18 months. I've had one legislative session and I'm looking forward to the next one. We've gotten a lot of things accomplished. First of all, I probably will not be the first in the nation, the only in the nation ombudsman for a while, because states from Virginia to Maine have contacted me, Utah, California. Other states want to start protecting their medical programs. To that end, you've probably seen in Maine, Massachusetts, and Arizona, referenda to actually go back to a medical only framework. We can't do that here, although legislatively we can, not through referendum. But what I have found is, thank God we got medical reciprocity, because all the states around us are doing it. It has helped to destigmatize to some extent and normalize to some extent our patient experiences. We've gotten the ability to have stronger flower, but we didn't completely embrace the term universality, which is one that I coined to have all cannabis people, customers, patients, be able to go into a store where they're age gated and buy whatever they want. If you go to a liquor store, you are age gated, and not when you walk in, but at the register, and you can buy beer or the most potent rum 151. Heretofore, when you walked into a dispensary or any dispensary that was medical, you could go to the medical side and get higher potencies, and you don't pay tax, which is a great benefit. But because of the diminishment of our numbers of patients, cultivators have not been incentivized to continue to make the products they were making before. So when you asked Mr. Rinaldi the question earlier, how's it going? I just sent out a survey to all 37,000 of our patients, and I've gotten 1,774 responses. Most people are not happy. They're saying that for example, you have a heart medication you're on for 10 years, all of a sudden you are told, get this generic, it's going to work fine. They're finding not only is it not as efficacious and they're not achieving their best health outcomes, but they're spending more money to get additional medication to supplement so that they have what would have been that original formula. So one of the issues is, yes, we got certain potency increases, but we didn't get in the concentrate side enough. And we still haven't really incentivized our producers. And to Lou's other point about social equity, most of our folks have not gotten up and running. And I was expecting we'd have a nice little craft program by now. We would have people who were patients who actually won licenses, and several have opened and already closed because they can't get inputs from the original four. That's a huge issue. When you tell people, come in, pay for a license, get a manufacturing plant, hire people, certainly people from the community, but also folks returning from prison terms, and you do that, and within 2 months, you're closed already? I've got people in the hospital as a result. We have patients who tell me they were waiting for that particular person to get up and growing, and now they're not. So we've done some good things. We had a very successful legislative and regulatory period last year in our first session, but I think we have a lot farther to go, and I think we're at an existential point right now.
So Tess, I want to bring you in on this as well, because I know that one of the big issues that we've continually read about is mold and yeast sort of like limits, and what exactly is or isn't an acceptable limit. I know we've seen sort of crazy figures here in Connecticut and elsewhere. But the other part to that as well is about remediation, and you gave testimony last year about how we label all of this sort of stuff and whether or not we're labeling it accurately so that people can make informed choices. But of course, all of this goes to people being able to buy what they hope is a quality product. And I suppose to Erin's point, and also to Lou's probably point as well, is whether or not it's efficacious enough and is doing its job.
Well, to your first point, the total yeast and mold limits, they do vary state by state. They're set at a colony forming unit. So it's not actually saying what's there. It's just saying there are certain types of fungal species that are present. And that does not distinguish between things that might be harmful, like human pathogens, or different fungal species that produce allergens or mycotoxins, or some of those less harmful microorganisms in that group of total yeast and mold, or TYM. So that in and of itself is really lacking a lot of scientific rigor. There's not a lot of research that investigates, what actually reflects a healthy plant. Some work has been done in Canada by Dr. Zamir Punja. He's done a lot of great work showing what environmental conditions can contribute to high levels of total yeast and mold. It makes sense for most of us that if you're in a warm, humid environment where maybe you have a lot of diseased plants or dead, decaying plant material, you're going to have higher levels of mold. And so he showed that definitively in some of his work from about a year ago. Demonstrating that, your airflow, your water quality, your environment plays a big role. Genetics play a big role in that too. Some plants are just more susceptible to being infected or colonized by some of these microorganisms. But the truth is that the scientific rigor is just not there. It's very challenging as an academic researcher that's funded by a federal, working at a federal entity, to actually investigate some of this work, not only because of Schedule I restrictions, which you can get around. You can get a Schedule I license and do that research. But as an academic researcher, I actually can't touch state legal cannabis. I can only source cannabis from the DEA, even if I have a Schedule I license. So just understanding the risks to consumers is very challenging, because traditionally academics would go out and buy cigarettes or buy, food products, and they do a whole slew of testing on that. You can't do that in all states. It's federally illegal to bring those flower products or other types of cannabis products into a federally funded institution. So that in and of itself is just a huge barrier, which will not really be alleviated by Schedule III, rescheduling those same problems will still exist.
We just want to quickly make a point. Sorry to interrupt you, Tess. We just want to make a point that I'm not sure if it's actually happened yet, but it's being mooted that the Trump administration is looking to reschedule to Schedule 3. Another thing I want to quickly pick up on, because we got a lot of questions and not a lot of time, so I apologize for jumping ahead. We talk about, or we hear about, I think, called remediation. Why is that so scary? Why is that an issue when it comes to cannabis? Just explain that to us, because I know it's complex.
Right. So remediation is a term that's very specific to cannabis. There's really no equivalent in the food industry for like herbal products or things like that. It is when usually it's cannabis flower, so it's that herbal plant material. It will fail for total yeast and molds, or it'll fail for a specific species that's tested for. So there are a handful of pathogens like the Aspergillus species that are tested for. And so if it'll fail for either one of 4 Aspergillus species, depending on the state, or whatever the TYM kind of limit is in those colony forming units per gram, then many states allow a manufacturer to treat that flower with some type of antimicrobial treatment. So ozone or radiation, hydrogen peroxide in some states is allowed. And that can arbitrarily kind of like bring those viable counts down, but it does not erase those microorganisms off of that product or any of their byproducts like the mycotoxins, other types of toxins like endotoxins that bacteria produce, or allergens, which can also be a problem both for cannabis workers who work in these environments with high levels of mold in the air, and for the consumers that can breathe that in. And there's actually been recently, there was a paper that came out this year that definitively showed that a person in Pennsylvania, a medical cannabis patient, used their medical cannabis. It had a species called Cryptococcus neoformans. It's a fungal pathogen that was on that plant material. She became infected and she died from her infections. And they were able to actually fingerprint basically the DNA of the crypto that was in her body and found it on her medical cannabis as well. And so that was really the first example where definitively they showed that you can become infected through contaminants. And it's also important to mention that no state actually tests for Cryptococcus neoformans. And so there's, again, another big gap there. And the problem with remediation is that instead of going back and addressing the root cause of the underlying contamination, like I said, many of these causes for high levels of mold, just like in your house, are the temperature, the sanitation, the air quality, the water quality, the humidity. And instead of going back and fixing that, basically they can just cover up that contamination and then not inform consumers that their product would have failed otherwise, and that it was recovered through this process of remediation. So not being transparent with consumers, that is actually against many other parallel industries. You cannot recover a moldy produce, for example. You can't just irradiate it and sell it to consumers. It's not done the same way it's done in food. So if you grow in an unsanitary environment, which many of these cannabis facilities, they don't have to pass health inspections like your local restaurant or even food manufacturers. In fact, dog food is produced with much higher levels of quality oversight and control than medical cannabis is. And so it's a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's no federal oversight. So the FDA has oversight over dog food. It does not have oversight on how medical cannabis is actually manufactured.
A majority of these products are sort of like grown inside. I know there are some outside growers. We do have one here in Connecticut. They're supposed to be temperature controlled and all that sort of stuff. So it's interesting when you say that there is no health and safety sort of criteria. And I'm guessing, part of the problem is they're just trying to grow so much now because, as Lou said, I think at the very top of this, a lot of the players here in Connecticut are legacy. So like corporations who were the medical marijuana growers who were first to get, hybrid licenses. So I'm guessing that like this mass production, this need to grow as much as possible to get it out the door to, keep profits is possibly another issue as to why we're seeing, the quality drop.
Absolutely. Quality is part of that too. I focus more on safety. So again, looking more at like pathogens. Quality is also an aspect. When you irradiate or treat with ozone, you are going to affect the terpene profile, which many people find adds to the therapeutic value, or at least that sensory experience that cannabis can provide for users and patients. But yeah, I do think that a lot of it is that these manufacturers and cultivators are just trying to get as much cannabis out the door. They grow them very densely, not good airflow. When plants are infected, instead of culling those plants and getting them out of their grow, they will try to recover those plant materials and maybe trim around the visible mold and then irradiate the rest. And so again, those are practices that would not be allowed in parallel industries. Like if you're growing basil or something like that, you can't do that. And so there's not only this big push to get as much out the door as possible, and on the shelves and out to consumers, but also they're missing all the good practices that are easily translatable from other industries, easily adopted into their good manufacturing practices, good agricultural practices. But because there is no enforcement, and because there is that legacy sort of disconnect with some of these regulated industries, like a good parallel is food, because there isn't a good connection there, a lot of those good practices are just missed. And that contributes to kind of the overdependence on kind of endpoint remediation to kind of cover up and get your product compliant. That doesn't necessarily mean it's safe. It just means it passed some testing barrier that the state put in place.
Greg's got a question.
So to turn this conversation to Erin, the legislature reconvenes in about 3 weeks? It's a short session. But is there anything that can be done, any practical measures that can be done over the next 6 months or year to improve what's happening in Connecticut? Or do we have to wait for changes on the federal level to make some of these things happen? Do you have an agenda, would I say, for this coming short session, Erin?
I absolutely do have an agenda. First of all, on the federal front, I don't know why Connecticut is not gearing up. They know that I was a designated party to the DEA rescheduling. Why aren't we using our expertise and our knowledge with University of New Haven, Yale, University of Connecticut, our 3 deep water ports, and our geographic proximity to position us for great leadership here? We've already established this office. Other states are following. Several of our provisions, like reciprocity and extension of medical cards and providing free medical cards to veterans and patients, are being picked up by states from Florida to Massachusetts. So let's continue to lead the way there. Aside from that, in the next session, yes, I think we have to tweak a couple things because, as I said, I think we're in an existential moment. Many of our patients in the survey have responded that I'd say 85% still go out of state to get their products. We have no diversity of products. We don't have teas and cookies and things that the elderly patients who contact my office need, particularly those who are in the end stages of life. They really can't smoke, and an edible's not going to do it. They want a cookie and they want tea. We need to get back to some of the products we had before. The main thing is universality. The only way we're going to get producers and manufacturers to cater to patients, they've told me directly, is if they can sell through to all consumers. So we need to tweak those rates, reduce the taxes, and incentivize those guys. Another thing we need is education. There's no bud tender training. So when folks go into dispensaries, no one is there to educate them or help them. We should really turn that around like other states require. And another thing I think we need to do is really, really improve the patient experience, because we don't have a Redura or any other label showing that there's been a remediation. Our QR codes lead to nowhere or to old batches. If you're an older person, you can't even use a QR code because they don't understand the technology. Right now, I met in November of 2024 with the DCP about the website not being ADA friendly or patient friendly. It's, quite a bit later and nothing's been done there. So we need to label differently with transparency, educate our public, educate our people in the stores, tweak the taxes, and try to bring patients back, because we've lost many to the surrounding states where it's cheaper and has more variety and better quality.
Lou, I want to bring you back in. You've been silent for a while, so we need to hear from you as well. I mean, as I said, you've been very vocal on many fronts with regards to, obviously, the whole cannabis situation. I mean, I looked at some figures recently, and this is direct off of the Department of Consumer Protection's website, the Cannabis Retail, and basically, we've plateaued out. I mean, looking at last year's end of 2024, adult use was about just under 18.5 million. Medical was just over 7. Although there isn't a December end point for 2025, they've got a November one. The figure actually for adult was around about the same figure, around 18.5 million. Medical had dropped by a staggering 2 and a bit million. The industry just seems to, it's not in free fall, clearly, but it's certainly not doing anything.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. And it comes back to what I said at the top about regulatory philosophy. We need to make a conscious decision to get away from the restrictive nature of the regulation that we have here, to look at an emerging market and a newer market like Connecticut, where coming up on the 3rd year of the anniversary of adult use, you've got a year-over-year decline in total combined sales. That's alarming. That's absolutely alarming, and that is radioactive to investment in the state. If you see that a market is contracting rather than expanding, what incentive do you have to invest in that state? Now, when we try to bring up the issues of quality and whatnot, and as Tess mentioned about remediation, we're not trying to say don't do these things. We're just looking for truth in advertising and accuracy in product labeling. In addition to the post-harvest remediation, now there's also the sort of these pre-harvest treatments that are happening with UVC radiation of flowering plants, which has been shown to have a negative impact on the trichome, which is crucial to the efficacy of the plant. So any adulterative treatment, I use that term because it's how it's defined in Connecticut general statute. But basically, any sort of processing treatment, we need to have disclosure there, because again, it's not about saying don't do these practices, but for that research that we hope is going to be enabled in the future, the best way to do that is to have a full accounting and record keeping of what individual batches underwent which specific treatments. Because if you don't have that historical data, it's going to impact your ability to do effective research in the future once it is possible. So we need to get away from this mentality of it's safe because it's tested. And we need to start bringing increased scientific rigor, as Tess mentioned as well. So I think that's going to be a good way to start rebuilding that trust and rebuilding that confidence. We don't have a great, our regulator is not particularly communicative with patients and consumers. When back in 2020, when they raised the allowable limits for total yeast and mold count, they did so in secret. They didn't communicate that, not even to the board of physicians for the medical program. So we've got some new leadership there. We've got some opportunities to kind of turn that around and begin to rebuild that trust. And another way that we can rebuild that trust is with Section 54 of Public Act 2379, which was our omnibus law that legalized cannabis in the state. But Section 54 specifically was a task force to study the impact of authorized cannabis sales and retail events organized for such sales. And that's basically a fancy way of saying home growers to have farmers markets and to look into, allowing that, what regulatory boundaries might be placed on such a thing, to explore the idea. Now that was passed into law, but it was never executed upon. So one of the other legislative priorities we have for the coming session is to bring that back into focus. So I'm just hoping we can revisit some of those kinds of things and be a little bit more populist in our regulation and our guidance around this, rather than the paternalistic, the nanny state, the command and control, and the prohibitionism that still is very much alive and well.
We're still way, way too expensive against, I'm looking at some figures here, it's around about $8 a gram. Massachusetts is half that. That's clearly not helping the situation either. People are just going over the border and buying it elsewhere.
Right, and that is a direct consequence of the limited amount of competition that we have in the market here and the limited amount of producers in the supply chain. There's all this talk about how our market is supposedly saturated. That's the data does not bear that out. It's an intricate dance between balancing the margins, the revenue, and the consumer cost. And we've done a poor job of that, but we've got a lot of opportunity to improve on that.
Well, let's hope so, because as we say, I mean, it is a market that could, if it's, dealt with correctly, could generate obviously a lot of very valuable revenue to the state. And of course, already within 3 years, we've seen Acreage Holdings, the botanists like chain, exit the market. They no longer are here in Connecticut. We've seen Air Wellness, which had a Manchester store, leave as well. So that's also concerning when we're seeing in such a short space of time, these big organisations saying, hey, it's not working for us here. Plenty to think about. And obviously my thanks to Erin Gorman Kirk, Lou Rinaldi and Tess Eidem, as well as Greg Stroud for, an interesting conversation, a beginning conversation about the state of play of cannabis marijuana here in the state of Connecticut. This is Seat Examiner Weekly, reporting and supporting what matters. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.